think the NES might be my favourite console, and NES games certainly have a distinctive look, sound and feel, instantly recognisable if you're a retro gamer. Partly because of the style at the time, but also because the technical limitations of the machine dictate so much about them. But there are a few games that are a bit unusual, games that push the limits of the system in unique ways to create something that is less typical of the NES. Games that stand out a bit, and I've got 5 of them to show you that are not that well known, that all have something about them that might surprise you, even if you really know this system well. Let's start out with Noah's Ark. And yes, there's a couple of glaring reasons why this is overlooked, why no one talks about it much. One, it seems to be a rare, total European exclusive, not released anywhere else. And 2, it sounds suspiciously like it might be one of those terrible, unlicensed religious games. Definitely guilty on the first charge, but not on the second. Yes, whilst it's definitely got a biblical bent, it is a Nintendo-approved game created by British company Source Research and Development and published by Konami Europe. And it is, well, it's far from terrible. It's a sort of hybrid, auto-scrolling platformer shoot-'em-up with some major quirks, including a rising water effect, unlike anything else you'll see on the NES. Yes, other games have water in them, but well, nothing so dramatic visually. What on earth is happening here? This is a game I have spoken a bit about before in a video I did about the NES's little-known grayscale mode. Hidden away in the graphics chip, the PPU, is a switch that, when flipped, turns everything black and white, making any game look like a Game Boy game, sort of. I have no idea why. That is a question I asked in that video, and no one in the comments really had a good answer. One thing does seem to be certain: if any other game developers knew about it, they didn't use it for anything except one that I've found, which I will talk about later. Here though, it's used in a very clever way to create this effect. Using the Meson emulator's event viewer debug feature, I can actually show you what's going on. The event viewer overlays information about what is happening in the game's code over the graphics in the form of these dots. If I slow it right down, we can see the key event where the game's code sends some data to what is called the mask register in the PPU, sort of like a little bank of switches that have a few functions, flipping the one that enables the monochrome graphics mode. This changes the colour mode as the screen is still being drawn, all of a sudden, so it suddenly flips kind of halfway down, which makes a, well, kind of convincing cartoon water effect. And by doing this at different points in successive frames, you can make the water appear to bob up and down quickly or rise and fall slowly to different levels. Some other game systems can do a similar but different trick, usually called a mid-frame palette swap, like here on the Sega Master System with this water effect in Sonic. In this version, it's not just flipping a switch, but swapping out the entire set of colours the game is using for another one. You can do it with any of the colours the system has, and you can use it to double the total number you can have on screen at once. The NES can do the same sort of thing, maybe, but it's hard to pull off. It takes some tricky programming and is only really suitable for static screens like this title screen for Indiana Jones, where it's used to create a colour gradient. The limitations of the NES usually mean you can't do the same sort of thing in an animated game scene unless you make use of the grayscale mode. Doing it this way doesn't take much processor time and it's easier to code, but the downside is it just makes everything into shades of grey. You can't change to any of the other 50 or so colours that make up the NES palette. But you can make use of another little known NES feature at the same time, the colour emphasis bits, more switches hidden in the PPU. These actually alter the whole NES colour palette slightly. Noah's Ark turns on the blue emphasis bits when it reaches the water, making everything below the waterline have a slight blue tinge. Depending on how you're watching this and what sort of device it is, it might be hard to see, but it is there. Not only that, but for everything above the waterline, this game uses all 3 colour emphasis bits at once, which actually makes all the colours a bit dimmer. Again, it's not a huge change, but there is one, a slightly different version of the familiar NES palette. A quick side-by-side comparison here, the original on the left, on the right, a hacked version with all the colour emphasis bits turned off. Not many games used these colour emphasis switches at all, making the 54 standard colours of the NES a really distinctive feature, one of the reasons you can spot an NES game from a mile away. The slight changes in colour in this game, well, they're not huge, but it does make it look less NES-like. Couple that with the rising water effect, and it's a bit of an odd duck. Compounded by, and major spoiler alert, I am going to ruin the ending, the very last boss is maybe Satan himself or Beelzebub or someone demonic, and he has a very slightly different trick than anything else in the game. He's drawn with background graphics, standard stuff for NES bosses because of sprite limitations, but usually that means you can't have any other background graphics around it without spoiling the trick. In this game though, we have a sort of pool of lava effect created with the colour emphasis bits, again actually switching them all on after being all off at the top part of the screen. There's also a hard line between the two sections, actually that's present with the water too, but it's more noticeable here, done by turning the background graphics off completely for one single line. And when you add in the brimstone nodules or whatever it is that plop onto the surface of the lava, it makes for a really interesting and original effect that no other NES game ever did. In all, this isn't absolutely the best game to bear the Konami brand. It's no Castlevania, but well, it is one on its own and worth being better known than it is. It's really cleverly programmed, someone put a lot of time into this, and it's not a cynical cash-in like the Wisdom Tree Bible games that it can be mistaken for. Next up, let's take a look at Gemfire. One of a few strategy games from Japanese company Koei, released not just in Japan but in the USA too, of course in English. They must have sold well enough for them to keep releasing them, but no one seems to ever have paid much attention to these games, not on anyone's list of top all-time NES titles, and not even mentioned as a hidden gem. Most of the time, Gemfire is probably the most accessible of these very deep technical games put out by this company, but still very, very different from your typical NES stuff. Home computers, yes, absolutely, but this isn't really NES material, is it? A heavy dork game, loads of words and stuff. Can you imagine this kid playing it? No, you cannot. But the graphics again here are a little bit different. The colour palette is... It's a bit pink, but there's no colour emphasis bits being used here. They just picked a really bright, standard palette, nothing particularly unusual. There is something strange though about the way the colours are used. You see, NES graphics are made up of tiles or character blocks, and each block of 4 must all use the same set of colours. Castlevania 3 being a really great example of graphics cleverly designed around this restriction. Gemfire though uses the MMC5 mapper, an enhancement chip built into the cartridge which takes this limit away. Here each individual tile can have its own set of colours out of the 54 that the NES has. Again, a small and subtle change, but one that does make this game slightly different and less NES-like. Even if you're not consciously aware of exactly what's going on, if you're a big NES fan, you might notice something odd. The only other games that ever made use of the colour enhancing properties of the MMC5 chip are other Koei strategy games and Enix's tactical RPG Just Breed. This really helps with tactical type games because it means you can have more colourful symbols that can be placed anywhere on a map without having to rely on sprites that can cause flicker when there's too many of them on screen at once. All these Koei strategy games, I'm probably not saying that right or even saying it consistently, but they are a bit odd for the NES. Uncharted Waters is another one, and that goes not just for the genre and how the game plays, but for how they were developed as well. It seems like this and all the others were written in C and compiled into bytecode that runs on a virtual machine running on the NES. If you're not familiar with programming topics or computer science stuff, that might not mean much, but let me tell you that is a very, very weird thing for an 8-bit console game to be doing. Other commercial games of any type for consoles and computers of this era aren't done like this. It makes sense though if Koei wanted their games to be very portable. They all appeared on multiple platforms, and doing it this way means that each game just has to have one code base which can then run anywhere that they can port their virtual machine to. Common in modern systems, widely used languages and frameworks like Java and Microsoft's .NET are based on similar ideas, though of course more sophisticated. Forward thinking definitely, and in fact the virtual machine that this runs can handle 32-bit operations, so you could actually call this a 32-bit NES game, sort of. That might be stretching a point too much for some people, but probably not stretching it too far for me to put it in the thumbnail, but whatever, it's another game that's not quite normal. But let's move on to something that is a bit more obvious in its weirdness, the amazing Cosmic Epsilon. A Japanese Famicom exclusive, but no translation needed on this one. It's all in English and hardly text heavy anyway. The standout thing about this, of course, is that textured ground effect, almost like something you'd see on the Super NES. Very impressive. I have talked about this game's sort of sequel, Tetrastar the Fighter, which does something very similar, but here the effect is maybe actually a bit nicer, certainly easier to see as it moves a bit more slowly. When I last looked at this effect, it did defeat me, but now I think I've got more of a grip on it. It does look quite a bit like the SNES Mode 7, and actually there are some similarities, but not really in the way that it works. An enhancement chip or mapper built into the cartridge does play a part in this. The NES or Famicom gets a bit of extra help, but this isn't like the Super NES Super FX chip. It's not a whole extra CPU or anything nearly so complex. This game uses the MMC3 mapper, the same chip used in literally hundreds of other NES games. In fact, nearly every game released in the later years of the NES used this chip or something similar. The clever part isn't in the chip, it's in the way it's used. To see how this works, we need to slow things right down to the point that we can see each line of the graphics being constructed, and take a look into the NES's video memory, that's the bit on the left, and also we've got the event viewer on the right. The yellow line represents the current line of pixels being drawn and sent out as a video signal. Notice that as the line moves down the screen, the image in the video memory changes. What's happening is the game is shifting through a series of templates, sections of floor pattern, just drawing a bit of each before skipping on to another one. There's a whole load of these stored in the cartridge ROM, and the textures on the ground are all made by stitching bits of them together to create different shapes. This is where the MMC3 chip comes in, because one of its functions is to allow games to use many different banks of graphics data. Original NES cartridges allowed for only 8 kilobytes of graphics, but the MMC3 allows much more. To access these banks of graphics data, the NES just needs to send a signal to the cartridge telling it what it needs. It's extremely quick and doesn't require any CPU time or memory bandwidth to load new graphics in, which Cosmic Epsilon exploits brilliantly. There's limitations in this method. You can't just use any image like the Super NES Mode 7, and you certainly can't rotate it, but it does look quite good. It might seem like a really strange way of doing things, but the NES's architecture just doesn't allow an effect like this to be drawn directly, so this is a very clever hack to make it happen. It's actually a sort of advanced version of the effect used to create the track in many old school driving games, and probably was inspired by Squaresoft's 3D World Runner, which has a slightly more primitive version of this ground patterning. It's a real shame these never got a Western release. I think it was planned at one point, but it never happened. But now on to something much less accessible to non-Japanese speakers. It's Metal Slader Glory. Yes, this game has two main issues that will put most NES fans off. One, it's very dense with Japanese text, and two, it's a visual novel. One of these problems we can solve thanks to a fan translation. In fact, there's two. The first by Stardust Crusaders in 2018 and a slightly different version by FC and Chill from 2021. For a long time, a sort of white whale, a legendary game not available in English that many pined for, but now it's playable at last. I feel like the whole visual novel concept is much better known these days, but if you're not familiar with the form, it's an illustrated and maybe minimally animated interactive story. Heavy on the story, less so usually on the interactive stuff. Not unheard of on the NES or at Famicom, I should really say, in Japan, and even in the West there were maybe one or two games in a similar vein, like Deja Vu. Even in Japan though, a visual novel like this, aimed at a more mature audience with some complex themes, is far more what you would expect to see on a home computer than a console. But again, the graphics are surprising for an NES game. You just don't expect to see so many detailed illustrations on a system like this. If you're a fan of manga visual style, broad as that is, but if you're a fan of this type of thing, I'm sure you'll appreciate it. The artwork really is fabulous. It's no surprise then that this is the largest officially released game for the Famicom or NES, clocking in at 1 whole megabyte, 25 times the size of a game like Super Mario Bros., and it's even twice the size of Super Mario World on the Super NES, and clearly a lot of that space is filled with graphics data. For home computers, even 8-bit ones, disk storage meant that games this size were relatively common. There's bigger C64 games, but for a console though, devoting so much space to graphics on an expensive medium like a cartridge is unusual. But it's not just storage concerns that makes these graphics difficult. Yes, the NES has other limitations. I've already mentioned colour palette. The NES has around 54 colours to work with, but also within any 16 by 16 pixel square, you can usually only have just 4 of those colours. And you're limited to how much unique detail you can have on screen. Normally you can have only 512 unique tiles or character blocks to make your graphics up out of, 256 for the static backgrounds and another 256 for moving objects or sprites. There are ways to increase this, and Metal Slader Glory does use a technique to double this number, but still there are serious constraints. A big reason why this game took 4 years to make. They had to construct all the graphics very carefully to fit within these limitations. Hardly excessive now, but back then it was a long time. This also uses the MMC5 chip like Gemfire, though not in all the ways it could have done. You can't really blame them for that though, it wouldn't have been available till late on in development, and it seems like the graphics were made for something simpler like the MMC3 chip, which can do less. Some sources say the game uses the MMC5 for parallax scrolling, but I can't find any of that, not actual true parallax backgrounds. There are some really impressive battle scenes though, with some really nice effects, but nothing that can't be explained by clever use of sprites. The game does use the chip to sort of split the screen up into 2 sections. Basically, the text part at the bottom is constructed separately from the main graphical elements, which probably makes the text easier to manipulate. It also means that you can have a new set of graphics for this bottom part, which makes it possible to have both detailed graphics at the top and a full text character set at the same time. This game was coded by none other than sadly missed Nintendo legend Satoru Iwata in his younger years, adding to its legendary status. It's really though the magnum opus of artist and writer Yoshimiru Hoshi, the creative force behind it. Despite having a large cult following, there's never really been a sequel or really any sort of similar work at all from the same guy. The Super Famicom did see Metal Slader Glory, the director's cut, like it sounds, an expanded edition, and that was the last game for the system, but that's been it since then though, apart from various merchandise. Don't get excited for an official English version of this anytime soon. Okay, now on to another game which spent a long time untranslated, Konami's Lagrange Point. There's a lot of things you could say about this. It's an 8-bit epic, one of the very few games that can compete with Metal Slader Glory's enormous ambitions. It's the music and the sound though that is absolutely the standout feature unique on this system, because Lagrange Point is enhanced with an extra sound chip in the cartridge. An FM synthesizer, not the same as but similar to the more advanced sound chips available as expansions for the MSX line of computers and the Japanese version of the Sega Master System. You could even probably put it in the same sort of league as what you would find in the 16-bit machines of the era too. A much richer sound than what you could ever expect from the standard Famicom, which really gives the game its own ambience. This though is very much a family computer game to give the system its full Japanese title. Usually when I feature Japanese exclusive games in videos like this, someone always pops up in the comments to point out that it's not an NES game at all, it's a Famicom game and my title is a lie. My usual response would be, well, it's the same thing, they're the same machine with different names. What works on one will work on the other with hardly any exceptions. This though is one of those exceptions because of that extra sound chip. The output of it is routed through one pin on the cartridge port that the Western NES just doesn't have, so even if you've got the required adapter or even if you run it from an EverDrive, you won't get the full sound for this game. It's not a complicated job to modify it though and enable the extra sound. There's even add-ons you can buy to help. This isn't a major architectural difference, it's just what seems like a fairly arbitrary change that Nintendo made. So absolutely this doesn't sound like an NES game because it's not, but it doesn't sound like a Famicom game either. It wasn't the only game with some sort of expanded audio released in Japan. The original version of Castlevania 3 has expanded audio too for one, and Metal Slader Glory does, but it's hardly used in that case. No other Famicom game though makes use of such a sophisticated FM synthesis chip as Lagrange Point. In terms of graphics, well, this is on the high end of what you can expect from the NES/Famicom. Compared to what was coming out just a few years previously, it looks really superb. When this was released in 1991, Konami knew every trick in the book. They wrote the book. They were better at NESing than Nintendo were at this point. So this is replete with all the clever hacks, workarounds and general old school wizardry they could cram in, which is quite a lot. Including a literally blink and you'll miss it appearance of grayscale mode, used in fading between scenes, and there's lots of sprite manipulation for all kinds of effects. I'm surprised this game doesn't seem to be that well known, doesn't have more of a cult following. Yes, it's a Japanese exclusive, but that didn't stop many other games from becoming legendary amongst Western gamers, begging for official releases and sometimes even getting them. It wasn't translated until 2014, although maybe that's a chicken and egg problem. No translation means no reputation, and no reputation means, well, you get the idea. But most revered 90s JRPGs are 16-bit and above, the Super NES being a big platform of course, and mostly they're from just a handful of well-loved developers. Konami was never really known for their RPGs, and it's not like this is part of a popular series either, it is a one-off. And yes, the sound may be top notch, the graphics really impressive, but this does play like a turbocharged 8-bit RPG rather than the stuff developers like Square made famous later on. This isn't Chrono Trigger, it's a bit grindy, quite linear, and well, my god, you'll be doing a lot of random battles. Play the game for half an hour and you will know the battle music off by heart, but still, if you're an RPG fan and you haven't played this, it is worth having a look at. And now I think the end once more, another video comes to its close. Thank you to my wonderful Patreons, please feel free to join them. I would really love it if you did, as it helps me out enormously, it really does. I do keep coming back to the NES, no doubt more to come on this subject, and any suggestions as to what I should cover would be greatly appreciated as always. Elite here is an obvious choice for a very non-NES-like NES game, but I have already mentioned this quite a few times, including doing a video devoted solely to it. If that interests you, well, check out the link which I will put below, and I won't go over old ground. So this is goodbye, I'll say thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.